Hi, my name's Stuart Lynch, and this is the final video in the three-part iOS navigation series for iOS 16. In the first two videos, we focused on the navigation stack, but in this video, we'll be looking at NavigationSplitView. We'll see how we can implement 2-column and 3-column split views that will compress down to a NavigationStack type navigation when the view width is compressed, like on all iPhones in portrait mode or on some split views on an iPad. We'll see how we can control the visibility of the different views and layouts. I love getting your feedback, so tap the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video and leave a comment below. Make sure you subscribe to the video and ring that bell to get notifications of new videos. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. I have a starter project for this tutorial, and I recommend that you download it and work along with me. By the end of this tutorial, you'll have a completed example of both 2- and 3-column split views and the code so that you can refer to it when you want to implement it within your own projects. Because our main focus will be on wider screens, I'm going to change my preview device to an iPad. And I'm going to choose an iPad Air 5th generation, because that's what I have. I can see by my first view that I have two tabs. One that is currently displaying a view called Employee List View, that currently only has a single text view in it. The second tab has a similar text view that says 3-column Companies List View. These are the two views that we want to code. I always feel that I want to design my apps using as close to real data as I can, so I use the Mockaroo website to generate data for me in the form of JSON that I can use in my application. I'll leave a link to this website in the description. I've done that, and I've created the JSON file, and I've stored it in my application bundle under the file mockdata.json. I've also created models for that data in my jsonmodels.swift file, and that matches that JSON structure. Now I've taken the employee model from within here and created a separate employee model in the models folder, and added a computed property called full name that just joins the first and last names. I've also taken the company JSON properties and created a single company struct. And the reason I have two different models here is that I want to rebuild the relationship between the company and the respective employees, as well as maintain a complete independent employees array. I've included a bundle extension that will allow me to easily decode the data. I also have a class called DataStore with two published properties, one being an array of company and another an array of employee. When DataStore is initialized, it calls a loadData function that will use the bundle extension to load and decode that data to populate those two arrays, and I use a sort key on both to sort the companies by name and employees by last name. None of this is really important to this video, except to say that if we instantiate this data store when we load our app, we can inject it into the environment and then use them in all of our views. In addition to that code, I've included some assets, namely the app icon using the new single image format introduced in iOS 16, and 3 images that we will be using, one for the company and one for the employee, and one that I'll use for my launch screen. As I mentioned, we want to inject this object into the environment and be able to use the data in all of our views. At the app entry point, the file marked @main, we can create a state object that I'm going to call store that will be an instance of this data store. And once it's created, the initializer will load the data and populate the store values. And then I can inject that into the environment. So in the Start tab view, we'll need to create an environment object that we can call store, that's of type data store, and we can inject that into the environment, which is our data store object. Then to stop the preview from complaining and allow us to see what we code, we can inject a new instance for the preview. I'm going to follow that exact same process for both Employees List View and for Companies List View. Let's start with a two-column split view. As I mentioned when I started this series in iOS 16, the navigation view has been separated into the NavigationStack and the new NavigationSplitView. The iPad has much more real estate, so displaying a simple list view in a single iPad view is really a waste of space. We can split the view into multiple columns if we like. And the NavigationSplitView has two different options, a two-column option and a three-column option. The two-column option is a sidebar detail, and the three-column is a sidebar content detail. So let's start with the two-column one. If I hit enter on the sidebar closure, the label gets removed and we're left with this. Each closure requires a view, and the sidebar is always going to be a list of items. So we can use a list view to iterate over our store employees array, giving us an employee iterator that we can display our employee's full name in a text view. And then we can set the font to a title size. For the detail, I'm just going to display an image using the employee asset. I see an immediate issue here in portrait mode where I am here. I don't see my sidebar, only the detail view. Well, this is the default behavior. I have to toggle that button at the top to see our sidebar. If I switch to landscape left or right though, I see it's fine. Well, for this app, that's not what I want. I always want to see the sidebar, as I think that I'm going to have enough room. Well, we can force that by adding a column visibility argument to our navigation split view, and this is a binding to some value. Well, I always want this to be shown, so I can use a constant binding here instead of creating a property that will change, and you can see that I have a number of options: all, automatic, detail only, or double column. I could use all or double column here because all is a two-column layout, so double column would be the same. This looks okay, but the problem is that it's an overlay on top of our detail view. And you'll see that's a problem in a minute, so let's leave it as is and we'll fix it shortly. First though, let's add a navigation title to our sidebar view, so we can attach that directly to the view, and we can use the string employees. We don't actually have any navigation yet, and in fact, our list is not even active yet. So how do we do this? Well, what we have to do is provide a value for the selected item in the list when we tap on it. And this will be a binding to some property that we'll need to declare, and initially it will be optional because nothing will be selected. Now, there are a couple of things that we can use for our binding. We could use, and the natural choice would be an employee type, so I can create a state property for this, and I can create a state property for this and update our selection. The problem is that I'm going to want to find that specific employee in my larger employees array, and for that I'll have to do it by finding by ID, because that's what's unique. And I build my detail screen, so I prefer to use the employee ID, and that's a string. Now I can add that selection argument to our list, and by default then, if I tap on one of the items in the list, the ID property will be assigned to that new state property. To test this, if we have an employee ID, I can unwrap it and display it as our detail view. If not, we'll just display the image that we had there before. Testing this now, I see that it's working. Initially, when no item is selected, we see the image. When I select one though, the image is replaced by that item's ID. There are a couple of things here though I can do to improve this. The first is, instead of specifying this ID as a string, I can use a generic employee.id, that's capital ID, and that will represent the ID property in an identifiable object. And this will work no matter what type the ID is. Now to get back to the problem of that overlay. In order to see the full ID property in the detail view, I have to tap on the detail view and then the sidebar disappears. Then I have to toggle it back again to get another one in the list. Well, I can fix this by adding one more modifier to our split view, and that's the NavigationSplitView style. And what we want to do here is to specify that we want it to be balanced. Now it's always showing permanently 2 columns. It may not appear so in the initial view because our image is not being resized. So let's make it resizable. I'll make it scale to fit. And then set a frame with a width of 300. Now that sidebar is always displayed unless I want to toggle it to dismiss it. And this is the case in both portrait and landscape modes. Before I design my detail view a little more though, I can see that this employee list sidebar is rather long. So to find an employee, I'll have to do a lot of scrolling. So let me add a search bar to the sidebar to allow it to narrow down my focus. And this is easy to do. Let me return to Data Store, and I'm going to add a new property called Employee Filter and initialize it as an empty string. I can then create a computed property called Filtered Employees that will be an array of an employee. And then if the employee filter is empty, we'll simply return the full employees array. Else, we can filter the employees where the iterators $0.fullname, and let's make sure that it's lowercase so we can do a comparison. We'll see that if it contains the employee filter, well, it's lowercased. Now I can return to our employees list view and change the list to be over the filtered employees instead. Then I can add a searchable modifier to the list that is bound to the text stored in the Store Employee Filter property. I can see now in the preview, when I tap the search bar, I can filter my list. Perfect. Now it's time to design a better looking detail view instead of just presenting that text field. Now at this point, you're probably still trying to figure out why I'm not using that full employee as my selection. And that would be valid. I just prefer this because it will allow me to find, based on the ID, the index or the actual employee from the larger employees array. And it serves me better in the future when I'm dealing with companies and their employees, so bear with me. So if I have an employee ID, how can I find that employee from the employees array? Well, I can create a function in my data store that will have an employee ID as a parameter and return an employee if found, so it has to be optional. Then we can simply return the first one from the employees array where the IDs match. I have enough information now then to create my detail view. So first, let's create a new SwiftUI file called Employee View. And we'll need to access our data store here. So I'll create an environment object for the store, and it has to be of type data store. And then once more, we'll have to fix our preview by injecting an instance of our data store into the preview. We'll also be passing in from our list an employee ID, which will be optional. So we'll need to create a property here that we can receive. And it's an optional employee.capital-ID. Now we want to display information about that employee if it's not optional. So we can use an if-let to unwrap it. Otherwise, we just want to display that placeholder image. So we can copy that from our previous view. Let's improve on that by embedding it in a VStack. And then below the image, I'll add a text view with the string Select Employee. And I'll set the font to a title size. Well, now we can work on displaying the employee information. First, we can check to see if we have an employee with that ID, and use an if-let to unwrap it here. Let's start with a VStack and display the employee company name. Now, unfortunately, because we haven't yet set an employee ID, we'll not see that change in the preview. Well, there's nothing stopping us, however, from grabbing a sample one and adding it to my preview. So let me return to my mock data JSON file, and I'll just copy one from here. And now I'll add an employee ID in the initializer in my preview provider. Now we see it, so let's increase the font to a large title size. Follow this with a text view showing the employee's full name, and then set the font to a title size. After this, create another text view where we want to display the employee slogan, but I want to have this displayed as enclosed within quotes. Well, I can do that by creating a quote within a string, but I'll have to escape it using a backslash. Then I can use a plus to concatenate the employee slogan, and then another plus to include another quote. I can set this font to a large title, apply a font weight of thin. I can add some italics, and then add some padding. Following this, I'm going to use a grid. And I have a full video on the new grid view, so I'll leave a link in the description if you want to explore it more. It allows me to create a nice layout very quickly. Start with a grid container, and inside there I want to create 2 grid rows. So for the first one, I'm going to set it to have an alignment to the top. And then I'll create a text view with a string department, and I'll make it bold. And I'm going to set it so that the grid column alignment is trailing. For the second item in this row, I'm going to create another text view using the actual employee department, but I'll set the grid alignment to leading so that they'll butt up against each other. And then for the second grid row, again I want it to be aligned to the top, and create another 2 text views. The first one being title, and we'll set it to bold. And then the second one will display the actual employee title. And the column alignments will be inherited from the previous row. Let's add some padding. Then I'll set a border around this and apply a primary color. Let's increase the size by changing the font to a Title III size. And then I'll add a spacer to push it up to the top. And finally, let me add some horizontal spacing of 20. Well, now that we have that done, I can return to my employee list view and replace the detail view with an instance of our new employee view, passing in our selected employee ID if there is one. You can see now in the preview that when I tap on an item in the list, I see that employee detail in the detail view. It also looks great in landscape mode. But what happens if I want to display this on an iPhone? There's certainly not enough room there. Well, it turns out that with the navigation split view, when you run it on an iPhone, it reduces itself to a standard NavigationStack type view, where the display item turns into a navigation link that pushes our views onto the stack. We'll look at this view in the full context of a tab view later, but in the meantime, let's switch back to an iPad and move on to a 3-column split view, which we'll be designing in the companies list view. So on this second tab now, when we present the companies list view, I want to use a 3-column layout. The first column will list all of the companies, and then we tap on one of them, the second column will display a list of employees for that company. And when I tap on one of those employees, it'll display that employee information in the rightmost column. And those last 2 columns will basically look the same as our 2-column employee tab, except that it will only list employees for that selected company. So to create a 3-column split view, let's replace our text view with that navigation split view using the sidebar content detail overload. Now we're going to start the same way that we did with our employees tab. We need to create this sidebar list of companies. So we'll need a property that we can change when I select one of them. So we'll start the same way as we did before, and we'll create a company ID this time that will be an optional company.id type, very similar to what we did with the employee ID. So this first closure then is our sidebar view, where we can present that list of companies from the store object, and we can bind the selection to that company ID. And this will provide us with that company iterator. So we can use that iterator now then to display a text view using the company name. And we'll set the font to a title size. That's pretty straightforward. You can see now that I have to toggle that button to see the sidebar, just like before. But I can tap on one of the items in the list and get it selected. So let's also add a navigation title, and I'm simply going to call it Companies. So let's solve that visibility problem first. Well, this time I'm going to create a state property called Column Visibility, and that is of type NavigationSplitView Visibility. And I'm going to initialize it as all, meaning I want all columns visible. And I'm doing this because later on I'm going to change this for certain conditions. So once that's created, I can add that column visibility argument to my NavigationSplitView container and bind it to that new property. The center column is the content column. And initially, when no company has been selected, I want to present an image so that there isn't just a blank screen. So if the company ID is equal to nil, I can create a VStack. And inside there, I'm going to create an image using the asset company. I'll make it resizable, scale to fit, and then, like before, I'm going to add a text view with the string select company. And I'll set the font size to a title size and add a little padding around the VStack. Now I'll need, as I did with the employee, a function to determine my company based on the selected ID. So back in the data store, I'm going to create a function very similar to before that I'll call company, that also has a single parameter, that I'll call ID, that's a string, and I'll have it return an optional country object. And for the body then, I will find from the companies array the first one where the iterated ID is equal to the parameter ID. With that done now, I can set up an else clause for when we tap on a company so that we can display a list. Well, that list will be a list of employees based on the selected company ID. And then when we tap on an employee, we'll want to display an employee detail. So we'll need to track which employee we tap on. Does that sound familiar? It's just like we did in the 2-column. So we'll need a property for an employee ID. And we'll repeat what we did before and just make it an optional employee.id type. Well, now that we have that ID, we can check to see if we find a company by using that store function that we just created. If we did, we can use an if-let to unwrap it, and we can use that company to iterate over all of its list of employees. And we can bind that now to the selection of that employee ID that we just created. So this will provide us with an employee iterator that we can use to display in a text view the employee's full name. And I can set the font to a title size. If we check this out now, we can tap on the company and the list of employees is displayed. Then, when we tap on the employee now, we want to display the employee detail. And we already have an employee view for that. So in the details section, I can simply present the employee view, passing in that selected employee ID. Testing now looks pretty good. I get placeholders when nothing is selected. But as I drill down, I get the employees for that particular company, and then when I tap on one of those, the right detail pane changes to reflect the item that we tapped on. The problem I see though is that the detail pane appears to be larger than what is displayed because the placeholder image is off to the right. Well, I can fix that just as I did before by balancing out our three columns. So again, I'm going to do this by applying a navigation split view style, and I'm going to use balance again. Let's also add a navigation title for that center pane or center column, and I'm just going to specify employees. If I switch now to portrait mode and view this on an iPhone, I want to see what happens. And as we saw previously, my split views collapsed down to a NavigationStack type presentation, and drilling down on the list pushes another one onto the stack. Well, there's just a couple other little tweaks here that we can use to learn more about how this split view works. Right now, when I tap on a company and then on an employee, the employee information is displayed. However, if I change companies, the employee list updates, but the details screen still shows that previously selected employee. What I'd like to do is that whenever I change a company ID, I can set the employee ID back to nil and thus display the placeholder image. And this is pretty easy to do because we can create an onChange event to monitor changes in the company ID. In the body then, every time it changes, we can set the employee ID back to nil. We never use the new value here, so I can just change this to an underscore. If we test now, we can see that it's working as designed. The second thing I want to do is once I select a country is I want to focus on its employees and employee detail, and I no longer want to see the sidebar. So to do this then, I'm going to create another onChange event that monitors for changes in the employee ID. Again, we don't need to see that new value. Well, in the case where the employee ID is not nil, I want to show all the columns. And that's why we created that column visibility property that's going to allow us to change, and we bound that to our navigation split view. So here, I want to set it to all. However, once I tap on an employee in the employee list, I want to set the column visibility to double column, which will display only the content and detail columns. Perfect. As a final test then, let's check to see what this looks like in a simulator on an iPad and an iPhone, and switch between tabs to see if it looks okay. So first the iPad, and you can see here that I have it in dark mode. The Employees tab looks good, and it has two columns. Switching to the Companies tab, I see it looks great in 3 columns, working as designed. Let me just quickly now switch over to an iPhone simulator and run it on an iPhone. This time we get the traditional stack view for both tabs. Well, that brings an end to this three-part series on iOS 16 navigation. I hope you can appreciate the improvements that have been made this year, and these 3 tutorials will have given you a basis for understanding so you can implement these in your own projects going forward. If you like this video and the series, please give the video a thumbs up and leave a comment. Be sure to subscribe to my channel and ring the bell to get notified when new posts are made. Thanks for watching.